Adesso, the Alliance for Peace Building, and WCAPS. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. We're very excited about this, the first of what we hope will be a number of webinars on the issue of decolonising aid. I wanted to say to you from the outset that this wasn't an easy report for us to write, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first is that this is a report of a consultation that took place over 3 days with 158 people. It produced a transcript that myself and my team trawled through. It was 120 pages of fantastic insights. And it's very hard to do justice to a 3-day conversation with such rich insights into a short report. So I want to say to you that this is our attempt at trying to condense a complex, highly nuanced and difficult, sensitive subject into a short report. And we've done our very best, but we know that I'm sure we could have done better. The second reason is that Peace Direct believes passionately about this issue, but we aren't experts ourselves. And I want to say that straight off, that we are learning. We are on a journey ourselves, and I suspect that we've made many mistakes along the way, and we are looking internally at how we can decolonize our own thinking, our own practice, our structures, and our governance. Internally, I think it was very difficult for us to figure out how to write this report and how to do justice to it, because we recognize ourselves that we are part of this system. The system that we see is riddled with structural racism. We are part of that, and we have benefited from it, a point that we make in the introduction to the report. But we feel so strongly that about these issues that we felt it was important to raise them as vocally as we could, but not to say that we were the experts. The third thing is, as I'm sure you will know, this is a sensitive subject, and it provokes quite strong emotions and reactions in people. And we have tried our very best to navigate this space. We are likely to have also made errors, but we hope that you will continue with us on this journey. For us, this is only the start, and I wanted to encourage you to keep join our social media output. Look at what we're producing on social media, because we are inviting you all to join us in an ongoing conversation about this, which will go on for beyond this year. So we hope to hold a series of consultations and produce further outputs which really try to go deeper into these issues. We are only scratching the surface in this report. So this is only the start. We can't hope to cover everything in one report, and we're going to go deeper into various aspects of the system that we feel are unjust, and that what we're hearing from practitioners around the world are unjust and structurally racist. So we look forward to having this conversation with you both as a webinar, but also through consultations on our platform, our dialogue platform for dialogue. Please sign up, because we will be having further consultations in the coming months. So watch this space. Now I'd like to just introduce you to our fabulous speakers, and then I will hand back to Shannon, and we can kick off with the day. So first we have Amjad Saleem. So Amjad Mohammed Saleem works for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, where he manages the Inclusion, Protection, Education and Learning Unit. This includes looking at work around decolonisation and addressing racism within the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and the broader Red Cross movement. Amjad, great to have you with us. Themrise Khan is an independent researcher with over 25 years of practitioner and policy-based experience in international development, aid effectiveness, gender and global migration. She's worked with many multilateral and bilateral organisations, INGO civil society organisations in Pakistan, South Asia and globally. She also speaks actively on notions of decolonisation, north-south imbalances of power, race relations and immigrant citizenship, and she lives and works in Pakistan. Welcome, Themrise. And finally, now I'm not sure if we actually have Jacques. I don't know, Shannon, whether we know if Jacques has joined us, but we do have a third speaker, but we weren't sure if he had joined. So I'll make the introduction in the hope that he's here, and we'll hope that Shannon will be able to loop him into the conversation. But we have Jacques Lumenge Lubangu, and he is the legal representative of the Association of the Survivors of the Makabola Massacres. He's an expert in conflict management with 20 years of experience based in South Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in his work, he faces constant challenges of working in isolated places, often with limited communication, which makes his and the work of fellow peace builders very difficult. And it's something that is dear to us because, as some of you will know, Peace Direct is committed to supporting local peace building efforts around the world and really amplifying the voices of local people and local communities who should be at the forefront of their efforts to build sustainable peace. And finally, I just wanted to mention and introduce you to Shannon Paige, the lead author of the report. So Shannon is our Scoville Fellow. She's based in our Washington, D.C. office, and we're absolutely delighted that as a Scoville Fellow, she was able to join us. So many thanks to the Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellowship for allowing and enabling Shannon to join Peace Direct for 9 months and to really lead this work for us. So I hope you enjoy and are stimulated by this conversation we're about to have. I'm going to hand it back over to Shannon and look forward to participating in the conversation with you all.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So as he mentioned, this is something that Peace Direct has been talking about for a long time and had that consultation in November of 2020, and it has culminated in this. And so we are going to share a presentation with you, and I will share some background on the consultation, and then we're going to get into our discussion. So if we could just share the PowerPoint. Perfect. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is a general overview of the events, and I do want to apologize. The slides are unfortunately not in Arabic, as we hadn't secured Arabic interpretation until the very last minute, and there simply wasn't an opportunity to make sure that they were available in all of the languages. But it was a joint consultation held between ADESO, the Alliance for Peace Building, WCAPS, and Peace Direct in November of last year. It was a participatory research event. So we used the peace design, the peace exchange model, and had 158 participants. And over the course of 3 days, we covered a number of different topics, from language to history to everything in between, and really got into some of the limitations of decolonization as an idea, as well as some of the ways that it's already been implemented, and people are really trying to do this work of shifting the power from the global north to the global south, and within the global south to every single community, even the most marginalized. So just going to pass this over to the next slide, please. And so here is where I want to invite our speakers to join me, and we're going to have a conversation. And unfortunately, we are still working to have Jacques join us, but we are going to talk a little bit about language and terminology. So when we were during the consultation, this was something that ended up taking the first day we talked about this for a lot of time. It really seemed to generate a lot of frustration, I think, for some people, because we were talking about how this language may in and of itself be colonial and may in and of itself be perpetuating these hierarchies that we were talking about. And so I'm turning it over to our speakers, Amjad and Themrise. And I'll start with you, Themrise. I know you have some strong feelings about the term decolonization yourself, and have actually written extensively on the matter, and would love to hear more about your views.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Peace Direct, for inviting me here today. I remember the consultation back in November, and I wasn't able to join into to the actual consultation groups because I came down with dengue fever, but I did participate in the online discussion initially. So thank you very much. Yes, I do have extremely strong views on decolonization. To begin with, I don't agree with the term, particularly when we're talking about aid, because in my view, decolonization is something that has a very distinct history. If you're looking at the word itself, and its historical basis was, it goes far back into the late 19th century Europe. But the first time I think in the modern world we came across it was after British colonialism ended after World War II. And the whole idea of the British colonizers moving away from the colonies was what they termed an act of decolonization. So I think that's the historical sort of aspect of it. And applying the term decolonization, which we are now doing to everything from literature to performing arts, to aid, to trade, to you name it, to academia. I think that is a little misconstrued, because if you want true decolonization, that means you need to end something, number one. And in our discussions, particularly in the context of aid, we are not talking about ending aid. We are talking about changing it or course correcting it. So that's one aspect, which is why I disagree. The second reason I disagree with it is because decolonization was a violent phenomena. I mean, all the former colonies, majority of them, when colonialism ended, it ended violently, including in my own country, in the Indian subcontinent. I'm sitting in Pakistan today because of how violently British colonialism ended. And I think that people tend to forget. So my memory of decolonization is that violent ending. And I don't think we want violence anymore, anywhere. So I think that's where, in terms of the reference to decolonization, I have a serious problem with. In terms of language, very interestingly, when I was looking into it last year, I tried to find a word for decolonization in Urdu, in my language, native language, and I couldn't find one. And then I looked it up on Google Translate, albeit, since I'm not a linguist. I looked it up in French and Spanish and Swahili and Arabic. And in none of those languages, except in Arabic, I remember, could I find an actual word in that native language. It was just decolonization, in just transliterated. And so for me, the idea is, if we can't even explain what we're trying to do to a global audience that has been so prone to colonization, what exactly are we doing? So if we can't talk in our own language and discuss our own issues in our own language, and we're co-opting the language of the colonizer, be it English, not even French or Spanish for that matter, what exactly are we doing that will create a level of independence or autonomy that we're looking for in the global South? So I think that's where I stand on it. And just one last point about decolonization is that I think when we talk about, if we want to talk about decolonization in its true violent upheaval type of form, we really need to then forget about aid, because aid is, and I hope I'm able to come back to this point later in the discussion, that aid is the whole idea of a soft image of a country. You want decolonization, you're really going to have to talk about the hard things and address the hard issues. You're going to have to address war. You're going to have to address conflict. You're going to have to address geopolitics. We're all seeing what's happening in Palestine today. We're going to have to talk about those issues and where they come from and how they impact global power structures. I mean, at the end of the day, aid is just a small little issue in all of this. So I'm just going to leave it at that for this particular segment.
Thank you so much, Themrise. I really appreciate you laying out exactly why you disagree with this word. And I think I would almost argue like this movement as we've conceptualized of it. And I would love to hear Amjad's take on it.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Dylan, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be part of the consultations and to be part of this. And thank you, Themrise, for setting the scene, which I completely agree with as well. I think one of the challenges has been in terms of even the co-option of language, right, is that decolonization has been, or the concept of racism discrimination has been co-opted to kind of discuss decolonization, right? So to some extent, what we have is that we have this conversation that started off very much last year, prompted by the George Floyd murders, and then you had sort of issues about racism discrimination, and then people started talking about decolonization, and so I think that there's been this merging of it, and to some extent it's also been quite beneficial, right? So as Themrise said, because decolonization is really changing the system. It's not even you're actually getting rid of the system, and you're trying to challenge the exact nature of the organization that you're working with, the system you're working within. And so if you divert that attention and sort of maybe focus a little bit more on racism, discrimination, in an attempt to discuss decolonization, then that itself is a way of deflection of the issue. So I think it's important that first and foremost, as Themrise was saying, these debates didn't start last year, right? They've been going on for much longer than we can even remember. That people have been organizing to counter ideologies of the oppressors, recognizing that struggle, and being careful about how we currently focus on issues of racism and discrimination, as opposed to looking at the deeper systemic issues, which is what Themrise alluded to. The other thing that I've been wanting to sort of say, particularly around language, is that I think as part of that, how we approach this thing, how we look at these questions, how we look at the problems, even the various terminologies that we use when we talk about global south, when you talk about beneficiary, when we talk about third world, or people of color, or we have BIPOC or BME in the youth. All of these are loaded terms, and actually this is part of the challenge that we need to understand, and we need to be aware of in this whole debate. When we view and we look at countries and say, well, that's corrupt, that's nepotistic, there's a human rights issue, we need to do due diligence on partners, the vocabulary of dependency, powerless, vulnerable, all of these are loaded issues, and all of these have that lens in which we look at things through this colonial period. But it's also just language, right? It's also images. If you look at, for example, I've been struck, for those of you who've been looking at the horrific COVID incidents that are coming out of India, how we've been literally put into the hospitals, into the emergency rooms, into the waiting rooms, looking at people suffering with emergency, doctors in the emergency rooms, looking at all of that. Yet when similar incidents were happening in the UK, US, right, people were very respectful about how they viewed those people who were suffering in the emergency rooms, right? So that image is also part of perpetuating a language around who the other person is, who that other person is on that side. So I think from our perspective, when we talk about deconstructing all of the ideologies, and when we talk about the language and image, I think this is part of it. But ultimately, it is part of that systemic change, and that's, as Dylan was saying, that all of us are coming from that system. So part of the elephant in the room, I guess, is how do we challenge that system, because that is what is ultimately creating the space. I'll leave it there.
I will say one thing that seemed to emerge from the conversations during the consultation was that people were falling back onto the term decolonization because it was a familiar term. And so while the usage is, I would argue, and I would agree with you, Themrise, to a degree incorrect, it isn't what decolonization is when we are talking about this. I think there is something in the very insistence on using a term that so many people are comfortable and familiar with that is arguably a form of decolonization. It means that more people feel comfortable accessing this conversation than they perhaps might if we were using a term that certain academics would argue is more correct for what we are discussing, which is decoloniality. So that is very much a term that came out of this academic movement from Latin America, which really does focus on addressing the matrix of power that has come out of the colonial period and the effects that it's continuing to have on us today. And I personally, I really am for any sort of linguistic simplification that means that it's more accessible to a broader group of people. And so I was wondering, when we come down to it, does it really matter whether we call it decolonization or something else that might more aptly describe it if it is an entry point for a lot of people?
You're addressing it to me first?
I mean, I'm
or
addressing it to both
Amjad?
of you, whoever wants to take it first.
Okay, should I go, Amjad, or would you like to?
Please go ahead.
Yes and no. Yes, because obviously familiarity does breed a lot more, I think, coherence. But who has created the familiarity? Again, for me, for somebody like me, not native to the North and the West, it's coming from there. And that to me is problematic to begin with, right? Everybody in the North may be very comfortable talking about it because it's coming directly from there and they're more familiar with it. I know a lot of my colleagues here in Pakistan and in South Asia. And South Asia has been very prominent, particularly in India academically, in bringing out the movement, the intellectual movement in the South, but they're not comfortable with it. And I know in particular practitioners, and I'm a practitioner, we are not comfortable with that term because we just think it is a skimming the surface, and B, we cannot relate to it because we relate, the word colonization for us brings back our history. And aid is not, I mean, yes, in a very, I guess, archaic or abstract way, aid is another form of colonization, but actually it's also not, because there is a level of acceptance on both sides. Now, the fact that how that came about and what the pressure to accept was is a different issue. But I think my point that I always try to make is that it's still at the end of the day something that's being imposed on the rest of us. And you're not talking to the rest of us enough about that. And language matters, it doesn't matter. It matters because you say decolonization has become a comfortable, and that was the title of one of my articles, that it's become a comfortable buzzword. And buzzwords matter because they bring in the audience. So in that sense, all right, you've pulled in the people you want in the conversation, but is it really reflecting what people want to talk about? So I think it's a bit of both. I personally think we should just dispense with the buzzwords because that's taking us off track in a lot of cases. And what we need to be talking about is how governments deal with each other and what the relationship between countries are across the world, why they have the partnership that they have and what each of them wants to get out of it. I think those are the more concrete issues we should be talking about. Once we get into semantics, I think we tend to lose control of the conversation, but then that's just my opinion coming as a practitioner.
I mean, maybe just to add on that, I think, you have the issue as well, as Themrise was saying, right, that decolonization is not a word that is easily translated into any other languages, right? So if you really want to have that ownership from the local, I mean, they need to actually understand what that means and what it signifies. We also have, parallel to this, we have the concept of localization, which has come up particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly after the World Humanitarian Summit, where something similar is being talked about, but again, that is providing agency and finances to local actors and enhancing that. We can debate whether that has achieved or not. So I think the challenge is that you're having a lot of these buzzwords coming across which have a lot of connection, but they're not being connected. And I think that's part of the challenge as well. I mean, semantics do matter, words do matter, but my problem has been with, particularly over the last year with decolonization, is that it's been used to kind of address internal racism, discrimination issues within organizations, as opposed to actually tackling what decolonization is supposed to be, which is very much akin to the localization agenda as well, which is there. So for me, that's where I find that some of the buzzwords, people are playing around with this, and that's a challenge, and that's something that we need to be really conscious of and mindful of.
I see questions in the chat asking what other terms we can use. And honestly, linguistics are so complicated. In the consultation, this really took up a lot of our time as we really tried to figure out what would be the best phrasing. What do terms like the white gaze mean? How does that impact us? But I do want to move on to other parts of our conversation to really dig into some of what Themrise was touching on when you were saying, well, aid isn't a form of colonization, which, as I'm sure you're aware, like during the consultation, certain participants would disagree with you, would argue that aid is in fact a continuation of colonization, though in a different form. And so I do want to just make sure that everyone understands the term the white gaze as we have used it in the report and as emerged during the consultation, which is that it's the process by which people and societies are viewed through the lens of whiteness as the default and as the goal. And so every sort of development progress is working us towards this idea of whiteness, Westernness, which has become synonymous with development and with progress. And so I think as we move, as we take these incredibly valid and incredibly nuanced critiques of terms like decolonization, and as we try and figure out words that can be applied to very specific context while also having a larger relevance, I will say, when we're talking about these things on a global scale, I do want to move on to our next slide and start talking a little bit about some of the histories of the aid system, because as we all know, humanitarian aid, international development, peace building is very, very easy for us to conceptualize of ourselves as apolitical and as neutral. And as I think a lot of people in this sector have done such great work and really view themselves as good actors. And yet we know that in the past we have, to varying degrees and in different ways, perpetuated stereotypes and perpetuated certain negative understandings of what development is, what actual progress is. And so I would love to take a look at some of these images our wonderful artists created. And to me, they're so evocative for the ways that the modern day aid system does rest on certain racist preconceptions and assumptions, and the ways that it is dependent to a degree on the ongoing dependency of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in the global South. And I would love to hear both of your takes on some of what we talked about in the consultation, which is, the colonial legacy of the aid system and to what degree we can truly divorce ourselves from it.
Maybe I can start and then Themrise. I think, the history of humanitarian action and aid is quite complex and quite contradictory as well, right? So I think there is definitely, we can't escape the fact that, a large portion of humanitarian organizations, particularly from that are Eurocentric or from, to use of a better term, the global North or the West, or however we want. Again, these terminologies are very problematic, but they are the grandchildren of the colonial, missionaries coming in and helping the poor, unfortunate people in Africa mainly, and then of course in Asia. That that asymmetric power that comes from a pedagogy that says that brown and Black subjects are not ready to take control of their destiny, so we have to help them, right? So I think that there's very much that history there that we have to be aware of, and we have to understand, and we can't disregard the lingering remnants of that. There are, of course, some of the big donor agencies, some of the big international humanitarian agencies are coming from former colonial powers as well, right? So I think that is there. The whole system is shaped from a Western Christian perspective. But having said that, there's also, and I've seen in the chat, there's also sort of the history of aid from other parts of the world, from Japan, from the Ottoman Empire, from all of that we also have there in the history. So I think it's important to kind of consider that, and that sort of complexity of the history of humanitarian action. I mean, from the Red Cross perspective, one of the things was that, when the Red Cross was first set up, it was really around the internal conflict within Europe, right? So it was to provide assistance to those that are affected by war, and it was Battle of Solferino, so Italy, France. So in that sense, it came up, and then, but a lot of the national societies that then emerged as a result of being branches of the colonial powers. So, for example, the Indian Red Cross was at one stage was an offshoot of the British Red Cross. It was a branch, right? So I mean, so we can't divorce that complexity. So I think that we have to be aware of that history. We have to be, but when we look at that history, we are looking at it from a we're looking with insight, and so we will look at the complexity, the contradictions. We look at it and then sort of realize how we can look at it from today. Again, it goes back to what Themrise pointed out earlier, that I think from my perspective, it's looking at where the system is and how the system is perpetuating this. And that's something that we really need to challenge and to ask. And so for me, the system of grants, humanitarian aid, development funds, all of those things, is that the right system? That's something that we need to look at. And for me, that's the conversation moving forward, because that's where the issues are coming forward. But of course, we don't recognize the contributions of Japan. We don't recognize the contributions of Turkey. We don't recognize the great systems that have come from India, the Indian subcontinent, in terms of how they've looked at it. So I think that that's something that we need to look at. The other thing, of course, just to bear in mind, is as we look at the colonial legacy of the aid system, is also to realize that at its bare minimum, humanitarian action is about human connection and about human solidarity, right? And so you have people from both sides trying to help each other because there's an issue. We saw that particularly in 2004 after the tsunami, where people, in the UK, US, just ordinary people, they were so affected by what happened, they just packed up and went to help, not because they were, but because they felt so strongly. And that human solidarity is something that we can't also throw out because it's something that we need to strengthen currently now, when human solidarity is being torn apart. So from my perspective, I think that's where the balance of the conversation has to happen.
I think as somebody who, my family's originally from the Caribbean, and my parents have often made a lot of jokes about remembering various aid officials coming to their respective villages to, provide whatever services and not really having any lasting benefits. It is difficult for me to then have entered into this field and to also make sure that I'm not in ways perpetuating the same things that my parents used to laugh at when I was a kid. And yet at the same time, I really take what you said, Amjad, about the solidarity of humanity. It is something that I deeply believe in. And I really do think, perhaps naively, that the majority of the people who do join this sector and the various fields within are motivated by the desire to see their fellow human being living a life of dignity, living a life of safety, and so on and so forth. But I do think we have to acknowledge that there are ways that that Western countries and the global North in particular are benefiting from a lot of our actions overseas. And I think in particular, when we're talking about aid flows, and I think this ties in with our next slide, when we're talking about aid flows, it is important to acknowledge just how often the funds map onto the ties of previous colonial paths. And so, you'll see a lot of previous colonial powers who will directly be funding areas and regions and countries that they had colonized in the past. And I think when people are looking at that, when people are critiquing the aid system, it is very difficult for them to not say, well, look at that then. What, isn't that indicative of something perhaps nefarious? Or others have argued that it's a form of reparation. In fact, that it's a form of unofficial, unacknowledged reparation, and that's what aid should serve as. But I would argue if it were to be considered a form of reparation, then it would have to be blatantly and vocally said to be so, because that would admit accountability. And I don't think we can term anything reparation unless we have that foundation in accountability and in recognition of, centuries of harm done. But I really do want to shift a little bit to some of the modern day manifestations of structural racism in the aid system. And so if we could go to our next slide, please. I think this graph that I tried to make it clearer, though I don't know if I quite succeeded. I think a lot of these aid flows that we see, they do go from the global north to the global south, as I was saying, and then there's an economic dependency that ends up being created as a lot of projects are not long-term, they aren't sustainable, and it creates, and we talked about this in the consultation, where local actors find themselves squabbling to constantly be awarded the next grant because they simply have to in order to survive. And so I would love to hear your takes on that, and even to begin to think about, well, how can we start changing the system to be more sustainable and really to sort of break this circle of dependency that has been generated over the past decades.
Themrise, would you like to?
Yeah, you want me to? Okay, sure. Just look, I mean, connected to, I think, the previous discussion as well and what Amjad was saying, I personally feel aid is a political act, okay? Call it international cooperation, development cooperation. You've got a number of people in the chat. I'm saying, we should just stop calling it aid. Call it what you want. It's money coming from one country and going to another country for X purpose, right? And I think aid politics is about power. So really what we're talking about is power, whether it's a former colonial power or a new colonial power or an ex-colonized power, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. And this is where the imbalances come in. I mean, China was technically not a colonial power. Look at where it is now, right? Look at the aid, look at the money it's giving. Let's not use the word aid. Look at the money it's giving globally and the power and the control it has over a number of countries because of that. Look at India, look at Brazil, look at Turkey, look at South Africa, look at the UAE now. The Arab world is coming up with a lot of what they call international aid assistance now. That was unheard of earlier. And all of it is with this intention of having some level of control over the economies of the countries that they provide that assistance to. I don't personally believe it's all altruistic. Some of it is, I'm sure, but majority of it isn't. The conceptualization of it isn't altruistic. And that's a reality I think we need to grapple with and understand. And so if Pakistan, for instance, had the amount of money that let's say the United States has, I think we would be in exactly the same position. We would impose ourselves on other countries. We wouldn't say we're doing this out of our good hearts. So I think we need to look at this system in that way, that whoever has the most is the one who has the most control. It doesn't matter whether they were former colonial powers or whether they're current powers. The fact is money talks, and politically money talks as well. So I think we need to move out of this idea of, everything is a colonial legacy. That was a long time ago. For some countries, I know it's still, only about maybe 30 to 40 years ago. Nevertheless, we are out of that. And we have the opportunity now, at least us, lower income countries or middle income countries, to do something about it. But we don't do anything about it. We still depend on the money that we get from other countries. And for me, that is the issue, right? How do we create our own power base within ourselves? And that, that's not happening. It's not happening in my country. And it's very frustrating for me as a Pakistani to witness this. So when people start talking about colonial legacy and racism and all that, yes, I mean, I think subconsciously a lot of it is still there, but I think we need to really move out of that now. And we need to move into where we are now globally. Look at the pandemic. Why is vaccination so unequal? Why has the pandemic, not only has it exposed inequality in poor countries, it's exposed inequality in rich countries as well. So why is that happening now today when colonialism doesn't exist? I mean, I'm sorry if it's because of something that happened, and I know colonialism has controlled us for centuries. It's not something that just happened for a short period of time. But at some point, we need to get out of that mindset and come into the current mindset about, okay, how do we exercise equal control over the resources that are available to us? So for me, I know it may sound simplistic, it may sound, very naive of me as well, but frankly, I think that's where we're stuck. And that's why countries like mine aren't moving either. And we're continuing to be dependent on others, and we're not creating our own autonomy and our own revenue streams. I also realize, I'm sorry, I think I'm talking too fast for the interpreter. My apologies. So I think currently that's my take on the legacy of colonialism and this whole debate on inequality.
Thank you. Also, thank you for the
sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, just on what the Themrise was saying, it's also a very good excuse for governments in countries like, where Themrise comes from, where I come from, or my parents come from, in terms of, to abrogate that responsibility, to kind of say, like, we inherited this, or, when this is not, it's not our fault, right? We have this colonial legacy, or we have this, and then, or when humanitarian aid comes in, that, they're supposed to be doing this, then, I mean, that's the role of the government, but then they abrogate that. So, I mean, I think there is that challenge in terms of how do you find that balance in terms of getting that agency to stand on your own feet and move forward, accepting a colonial, we have a colonial past, it's there, but we have to move forward, and these are some of the challenges that all of us can start to look at, and that's why the system as well has to also be challenged and addressed. So that's something that I think that, I mean, perhaps not in this sort of space, but that's a call that we all need to be looking at as well.
I will say, though, I am reluctant to minimize the effects of colonialism. I think because especially when we are looking at a lot of the ways that the international aid system relates to local communities. And so I think there is an argument to be made that the larger aid system itself, has various interests, and to tie them all to colonialism, I agree, Themrise is quite simplistic and reductive. But during the consultation, a number of participants shared extremely personal experiences of them being presumed to lack capacity, or their organization not being trusted with funding. In fact, in one of the region-specific Zoom conversations that we had, the Latin American conversation, there was a really interesting thread that was running through, which was that so often stereotypes around Latin America revolve around us being pleasant and enjoying parties and so on. And so that then translated to a reluctance to fund and to trust Latin American organizations with their own funding. And so things like that, to me, I think are really indicative of how there are underlying beliefs that do stem from colonial periods that continue to impact local communities and continue to impact the way that we, as an international global aid system, work with them. And so how can we really begin to unpick some of this? And so this is where I think as we move into the next portion of our event, we're going to share some of the recommendations, and then I am going to invite you all to join some breakout rooms, because this is a conversation. I mean, the chat is just going and going. There are too many of us to really get into this as we would like to, but I think having breakout rooms, maximum 10 people, there are breakout rooms for different languages, so you can pick a breakout room according to your linguistic preference. And it's a self-assigned breakout room. If you have challenges, we can assign you. But I think it is important for us to have this conversation together to also try and figure out what does that actually look like when we're talking about like the future of the system, because structural racism is present here, and to deny that, I think, would be a disservice to the experiences that people shared during the consultation and the experiences that I think all three of us know people have had. But I am going to just take a minute and, like, moving on to the next slide, going to start talking about some of the recommendations. So in the report, if you haven't read it, you will see that we divided it according to the stakeholder that we were specifically speaking to. And the first recommendation, which is to acknowledge the presence of structural racism and unequal power dynamics. I mean, as Themrise said, money talks. And so there is value in the global north acknowledging that they hold a position that is unique and that is unequal when it comes to a lot of the communities that they are working with and that they are funding. And so how does that then manifest moving forward, and how can we ground our future efforts in that acknowledgement and make sure that we're trying to create more horizontal relationships? In terms of funding, fund courageously. So often throughout the consultation, participants shared organizations being reluctant to fund them for fear of failure or mismanagement or various things to that effect. And the fact of the matter is those things can happen if you're funding an organization based here in Washington, DC, or if you're funding an organization based in, to use my own example, Port of Spain, Trinidad. The likelihood of mismanagement isn't increased because Port of Spain is full of Black people and Indian people and Chinese people. And to presume that, that's when we come into these racist undertones that I think too often we're reluctant to acknowledge, which is, why do we assume that certain groups and certain communities are less trustworthy when it comes to funding? And so we have to be brave, and we have to acknowledge that failure is an inevitability when it comes to funding, especially the large funding that a lot of people are doing. And to continue with this, I think, our next slide, please. Thank you. And to continue with this, we talked about Indigenous knowledge. We talked about local research. If COVID-19 has proven anything, it's that local communities can and are doing their own research, and that people in the global north are able to benefit from it. And so why haven't we invested in local research in a meaningful way in the past? And how can we really take this opportunity, to call it COVID an opportunity is perhaps not quite what I want to do, but to take this period, I would say, and like the things that we have learned to move forward, knowing that, okay, we have seen it be done. So how can we ensure that we don't backslide in the aftermath of COVID as some countries are starting to look to the future? And I think part of that also means acknowledging that people think in different ways. And so how somebody conceptualizes of development, conceptualizes of peace is likely to be incredibly different. And so that really truly matters when developing a program and then developing goals in particular. Moving on to some of our other recommendations on our next slide. Perfect. The idea of no more white saviors. So much of our work is rooted in this idea that white Western people have the answer and can guide us. And that is not only incredibly condescending and patronizing when it comes to populations of color, but it does affect the way that we engage with communities, such as the use of random Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, and often children, to promote our own efforts and to encourage fundraising, and also the assumption that we are going to be in those regions forever and that we are going to support those regions forever. So we need to adopt a transition mindset and work to no longer be needed, because ideally we will have helped whatever community reaches a stage of self-reliance. And just moving on to some of our next slides, please. Great. And so reevaluate partnerships. Amjad, you talked about localization, and throughout the consultation, we essentially concluded that the localization effort, while valiant, had been limited because it refused to talk about some of the very uncomfortable realities, which include racism. And so when we are building these partnerships, we can't simply focus on, funding local communities, but we also have to think, okay, well, in those communities, are we prioritizing the people who speak English? Are we prioritizing the people who, have a form of Western education and degrees that we recognize and that we deem legitimate and indicative of their ability to handle a program or project. When we're talking about partnerships, are they long-term? Are they reciprocal? And this, I think, is the hardest. Are they trusting? Do people trust that you will continue to care about them? Is the investment reciprocal, or is it extractive? So there are a lot of different considerations that we want to invite, and we want to invite you all to discuss. And I am going to move on to our final slides, which I think are the most difficult few slides for people when we're talking about this issue, which is individual responsibility. So I am, I'm a woman, I am Black, I'm also an American citizen. And so to understand that my identities don't exist in a vacuum, and that I do hold privileges in many ways, whilst also, experiencing various other forms of discrimination, that intersectional approach is vital. But it is important to understand how I am perceived by others as well, while how I am perceived because of who I am, the way I speak, the fact that I do speak English, all of these things matter. And so I think when we're engaging with this, and when we're talking about redressing some of the existing power dynamics and creating a more horizontal aid system moving forward, how have you benefited? We need to ask ourselves, like, how have we benefited from racist and discriminatory systems? Because we all have, to varying degrees and in various ways. And when it comes to thinking about our own communities, I know Peace Direct, we're having a lot of conversations about what does it mean to be a peace building organization based in Washington, DC, where there's a huge amount of gun conflict. And how can we call ourselves peace builders if we aren't looking in our own backyards and seeing what's happening right here? And so trying to really expand our idea of what aid needs to be, what success is, and trying to ensure that we aren't looking overseas to avoid what's happening at home. And, of course, how have we inadvertently propped up structures of racism? And moving on to our next slide, I'm going to run through this because I do want to give us a good chunk of time in our breakout rooms to really invite you all to dig into this. There will be criticism. How are you going to respond? People won't agree. I mean, even just a panel of the three of us having a conversation, we haven't agreed on a number of things, and yet that ability to keep having these conversations and to keep thinking and to think, okay, well, if we're not going to use decolonization, what might that look like instead? That's essential. When we're talking about new forms of knowledge, it means that there are going to be times that you're going to be wrong, and that you aren't best placed to respond to things. You don't know what a community needs. And so I think all of these things are important when we're moving forward with an idea of this. And then our final slide before I ask you all to self-select into some breakout rooms to further this conversation. When is it your turn to speak? I think that's something that we are really, really working on. It's not everybody is best positioned to speak on this issue. And when are you able to pass the mic? And so before we go into breakout rooms, I would just love to have Themrise and Amjad share a little bit on your thoughts on these recommendations, the limitations you see for them, the opportunities, how it might relate to your own work. I also know that we have finally, apologies, everyone, solved a number of our issues with regards to access for this meeting. And so it has been recorded. We will be sharing with everyone, but I do want to give people a chance to engage with you and hear some of your really interesting thoughts, because yeah, you're incredible speakers and incredible thinkers.
Thank you, Shannon. Maybe first of all, I see that. These recommendations are things that really speak to me, because I think that what they look at is obviously the big change that needs to happen, but also what can I do, right? Because I know that I have things that I can do. I can affect change from myself in my own little world, and there are things that I can be concerned about in trying to influence that. So for me, there seems to be a bit of a okay, so I can continue. Great. So from my perspective, it is really seeing what I can do from my end. That's what is really great about this, because, you know, to all intents and purposes, we often talk about the big picture, but then when it comes to, okay, what can you do about it, is then the next step. And so for me, just reflecting and, you know, being someone like you, right? I mean, I have heritage. My parents come from the Indian subcontinent, but I'm in the UK. I work for an international organization. How am I perpetuating the same kind of perceptions about engaging with local partners? How am I sort of helping to change that narrative around that? You know, when I talk around work in as a diaspora member, how do we put that forward? And we have to ask ourselves that, because often some of that misperception is also based on us, because we perpetuate a certain image around the countries that we come from, because it suits our narrative. So I think it's important that we look at that. The other thing, I guess, in terms of shifting access and power, I mean, you talked around, I mean, I see COVID-19 as the opportunity and a blueprint for us to change things, because for the first time, the international community was really, really struck in terms of how they could respond, and they couldn't, right? Because they literally couldn't move. And so you had to engage with local partners. You had to sort of provide that support, that remote support, that accompaniment. But actually, at the end of the day, people on the ground worked, and they worked actually better in some perspectives. So I think that there's a huge chance now for us to reframe that conversation, at least to within the fact that still the system of aid, still the system of money flow, all of that is still very apparent. But in this line of actually changing the view of how we work on this, I mean, I think that's the opportunity that we have, that we can build those local partners, those local organizations. We can work in partnership with them. We can work in accompanying them. So, I mean, for me, I think that's where I see a lot of those conversations taking place. And then the last aspect is, okay, you know, the hard question, which is are we brave enough to take the next step, right? And that's something that I guess is the unanswered question, right? Because I think that's where we work. And I remember when I first got into this line of work, I mean, I had a really brilliant boss who sort of said that your role is to make yourself redundant. You shouldn't be there, you know. And he was like, he stood out amongst everyone else who were basically looking after the job, but he was like, no, you have to get yourself out, because you've built up and you've empowered them. So I think that's the question that that's the question we need to be asking, is particularly from the international aid industry, how do we make ourselves redundant? And that is addressing some of the recommendations that have come up here.
Themrise, over to you.
All right, thanks. I know I completely agree with Amjad, especially about the redundancy aspect, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I also completely echo his thoughts about, you know, the diaspora. I'm a member of two diasporas, one a Western one and a non-Western one, and I face the challenges of not being accepted because of my origin in both. In the West, I'm not accepted because I am not, quote unquote, one of them. Even though I'm working in a sector which is supposed to be working in countries like mine, but my knowledge is not good enough for anybody there. You know, until it originates from a white person, it's not knowledge, really. So having faced that head on, you know, in the West, and then in your own country where you are working directly again with both your own fellow citizens and as well as people from expatriates from abroad. And again, you are torn between the two. Your loyalty is to your people, but your employment is foreign. You know, that dichotomy has really, I think, put all of us in a very difficult position, which I think a lot of us are starting to question now. You know, I started to question it and I left it because I'm not doing this anymore. So I think that tussle of the idea of shifting and accessing power and what we as individuals can do, I think is very important from our end as well, at the receiving end, because we imbibe all the power structures that are imposed on us. And I think we need to break away from that. And secondly, just going back to the issue of coloniality, I say this because right now I'm sitting in sweltering heat. There's no power. The lights just are running on a UPS, which is going to die soon. And this is a regular occurrence in Pakistan. You know, power infrastructure is decimated. You know, we can barely carry on. And this is not, I mean, it's a massive, it's one of our biggest issues in the country, our power grid. But this is not an issue of colonialism. This is not a legacy colonialism left behind. This is us. We haven't been able to handle this. And exactly the same as in all other sectors, in education, in health, in women, in our financial management. This is us. So when I say we need to move beyond colonialism, and I've seen comments of people saying that, you know, there's a new colonialism and all that. Fine. I mean, yes, I mean, again, it's an issue of us being controlled by somebody else. But I sincerely think in this case, we have the option to say no, which we earlier didn't. And why we don't say no is what we need to look at very carefully. You know, because I want power. I want everybody in my country to have power. And I know that's not something white people brought in, and we don't have power because white people haven't done enough for us, or because we are, you know, subservient to them. This is us. And all our problems internally that we face today, there is a history of colonialism that we follow. We do see it now and then. We see it in our curriculum, for instance, our education curriculum, but it is biased. But we are the ones who need to work towards improving our own situation, and constantly saying that there is a legacy behind us of colonialism and this is new colonialism. Well, we have a choice. You know, it may be a terrible, hard choice that may take us down a horrible road we don't want to go. Fine, that's understandable. But we have a choice, and I think that is the biggest difference between what happened then and what is happening now. And we're not exercising that choice for a number of reasons.
I do want to pick on that a little bit. I want to kind of unravel some of your thinking, because how much of a choice can we really call it when the options are, you know, you don't accept whatever aid money and then your people go hungry, or you do accept the aid money with the understanding that there are all of these strings that are attached to it that might, you know, affect you in the long term, but in the short term, your people won't go hungry. I think we're really putting a lot of people between a rock and a hard place. And I personally am uncomfortable putting all of the onus on countries that are maybe 30, 40, 50 years old and are trying to build themselves up from nothing. I know that, you know, my father is older than our independence, and he jokes about that all the time, being 8 years old, and he's old enough to remember us gaining our independence. And so when you think about that, and you think about the fact that the resources, and by which I mean the environment of our countries, have been exploited in the past, we are starting with a deficit. We are starting with behind, and to ignore that and to minimize that when we are talking about aid and the responsibility that we as people have towards one another. I'm not saying that we should lambast the global north for having once been a part of the colonial project, but I'm saying if as aid practitioners, we truly believe that every human life has dignity, then I think we need to stop thinking about things in terms of ownership, or in terms of I think the notion of power, to me, needs to be removed from this conversation, because at the end of the day, while it is inherent, it isn't the point. The point is to keep people safe. The point is to keep people healthy and well. And so how can we get to a stage where we are no longer thinking about these exchanges in terms of a very transactional type of relationship, but really conceptualizing ourselves as part of a whole that are working together to benefit one another?
Did you want me to come back on that, or did you want to
both
take it
of
into
you?
breakout rooms?
I think because so many people have just joined us, I'm glad you asked. I don't think we're going to do breakout rooms. I just want to continue this conversation for as much as possible. So even those who joined us a bit later are still able to be a part of this. And actually, in about 3 minutes, I'm going to invite people to raise their hands and to ask questions. So we're going to have a conversation here. I think that will be a wonderful way to continue this. And so, yeah, I would love to hear your response. And then perhaps I'm just incredibly naive before we move on to the next section.
Sure. Look, I know a lot of people don't agree with my perspective, and I'm not putting a blanket sort of opinion on the whole of Global South. You know, we're all different in different contexts, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there are a lot who are just starting out. We started out the same way. You know, we had nothing when our country was born, right? We built it up over the years, and we absolutely started with a deficit. And a lot of our infrastructure was built in the 50s with foreign loans, because obviously we had no money of our own, right? So the system did begin then. But my point is that there is a certain level of, I mean, if we are saying that we are so subservient to our past that we don't even have the ability to say that we don't have any mechanisms to be able to, for instance, generate our own revenue, you know, I think that's a real cop-out. We do. I know we have ways to generate our revenue. It's just been siphoned off by the political elite of this country. And you can say, okay, the political elite were, they came about because of our colonial history, but no, they actually didn't. They were always there. They were these families were the political elite even during colonialism, right? My point is just that we need to start thinking internally about where we feel our deficit is and how we can come up with ways to reduce that deficit and to reduce dependency. I don't think that's impossible, you know. And I don't think we can all constantly say, I mean, it's very frustrating for me because here I am in a country which has been independent for 70 years now, right? Yet we are dependent, and not just to the West, we're dependent to, to Saudi Arabia, we're dependent to China, we're dependent to even Turkey, right? We're dependent on all these countries that, were not colonial, were not ruled. I mean, they were empires in their own right, yes. But why are we still out with a begging bowl when we still have so many internal resources that we can use for our own benefit? Right? This is what donors keep telling us. Everybody who comes to this part of the world and says, you've got so much, it's just that you're wasting it yourself. Well, yes, we are wasting it ourselves. And you're helping us to do it as well. That's the truth. So for me, it is this frustration that we do have so much going for ourselves. And I think a lot of countries eventually will, even the fledgling countries will. But it's this mindset that says, it's where the money is coming from. And because we need to do better, we need to grow, we need to develop as a country, the only way we'll do it is if we take these loans now. And then, you're forever stuck for the rest of your lives, unless you manage it with some level of negotiation, I suppose, for lack of a better term.
Thank you so much, Themrise. Amjad, I'm sorry, I am going to open it up actually to our wonderful and incredibly patient audience members. And so I invite you all to raise your hands if you have a question using the raise hand function at the bottom. If you see the smiley face with the plus arrow, that will direct you to the raise hand function. If you can't figure that out, simply type raise hand in the chat and we can call on you. I will say that unfortunately, since we are providing interpretation in a number of languages, we will have to ask that the questions be in English so that the interpreters are able to translate for our various audience members. So I don't see any raised hands. And so in the interim, Amjad, would you like to respond to what Themrise says while we collect a few raised hands before moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're discussing here is what I
Sí,
think.
lo que estamos hablando ahora mismo.
Oh. Sorry, do we have a question or?
No, I think that was a mistake. I'm going
Okay.
to try muting all and then going from there. And yes, thank you. We can stop the screen share. Let's actually see each other and have a conversation. Mhm.
So I think what I was alluding to, that this is a very complex and contradictory issue, and I think what we're seeing here and the conversation in the chat is that, you know, there's no one opinion, there's no binary opinion on this, right? And I think
Mhm.
and the fact is that this is also interwoven with issues of power, issues of governance, issue of international politics and geopolitics and all of those. And I think that's
Mhm.
where, you know, that's where you then start to think, okay, this is a much more complex conversation than just, let's just look at the aid sector in isolation. You can't. There are much more wider perspectives, which is why then you come back to, okay, what is it that we can do, at least from where we are, where we are sitting, right? Because ultimately, if we really want to talk about this, you know what we're currently, what we've been talking about, and where I think some of the localization kind of debates may have also moved, is that we're sort of saying, where we're in this car and it's being driven by someone else. What we want to do is get someone else to drive the car, and maybe go in a different car, but the road is the same, the direction is the same, the destination is the same. The question that we need to be asking is, do we need the road? Can we get somewhere else? Is that the right destination, or is there anywhere else we can get to the destination? But the problem is, when you start to unpack that, that's a whole wider conversation than what we're having here. So, you know, that's why we stick to tinkering around and sort of saying, let's change the driver, because, you know, that's more palatable. So it is a complex thing. It is quite challenging in that sense. But I mean, there is responsibility on us or countries from the globe, for use of a better word, the global south, to take that responsibility to move that conversation forward. There is also responsibility to recognize that there has been damage done from the colonial histories. There's been colonial damage that has been done. A lot of countries inherited a system of governance, a system of looking at how communities were formed and separated based on ethnicity or religion or whatever, that didn't exist before the colonial rulers, and so that has damaged it. But I think the onus is then to recognize that, but also then how do we have to take that conversation forward, right? And so we have to hold people accountable for that, but also that accountability is on us as well to take that forward. I mean, you can't have it both ways, right? I mean, that's the thing.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to call on John and then Ralph, and then I think we probably have time for probably one more question before we're at time. So John, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thank you. And hopefully I'm speaking slow enough it can be translated. What has been learnt from the process about how to go beyond recognizing the need to shift power to actually, and this sounds really cliched, a roadmap to giving it away, so neither the people who have funds who want to do good or partner organizations which feel like you're always telling us what to do and we want to own our own future actually have the institutional space to move together? Because it sounds like your conversations that the report created were exploring some of that space, and it feels like a lot of us know where we want to get to and are actually struggling with how do we do the middle bit. Thank you.
Well, before I pass it over to our wonderful speakers, I will say that this is hopefully the first of many more conversations that Peace Direct is hoping to have. We are planning to have a number of thematic conversations. And so one area that we feel the report didn't have the opportunity to go into in as much depth as we would have liked was the issue of intersectionality and how women, youth, those with disabilities, those from marginalized identities are particularly affected by this. And so that's a conversation we would like to have moving forward, as well as a conversation specifically for INGOs in terms of partnership building, what that might look like in a more, power sharing fashion. Similarly, we're having conversations with various funders as to how they might fund differently, how they might adopt a bit more of a bit less of a risk-averse approach and moving forward. So I will say that this is the first of many. I think the next one should be held sometime in July. So keep your eyes out for anything around that. But I will now pass it over to our wonderful speakers to share their insights into this.
John, it's a very, very tough question. I think, as Shannon said, I think that there's a lot of things. I mean, I'd be also interested to see how this process goes, because I think that there's a lot of suggestions there. I mean, part of it is also just from myself being, extremely brave to actually ask those questions and then push back on donors and so say, well, actually, no, we're not gonna do that. I mean, I was in another webinar where someone was saying, she's an academic, and she's sort of saying, well, when we go out to partners in the global south, we ask them, we do a due diligence on them, right? Because that's required of us by the donor. But why can't they do due diligence on us? And so can we ask them? If they don't like us, then they're free to push back. So I mean, from my perspective, I think that it really boils down to sort of the bravery of standing up and sort of saying we need to be able to change that system. We'd like to push back, and we'd like to experiment with how we can do things differently. But ultimately, as we've talked today, that a lot of it is down to power dynamics of finances, right? And so many of the organizations that we work for, that we know of, would be very, very reluctant to basically push back to their donors, who are effectively their financial backers, to sort of say, well, actually, we don't see it like that, right? We don't see you doing that. And I think that's where the challenge is. And so if we can get someone brave enough to kind of say, well, actually, no, you know what? If you're not going to, if you can't do it like this, sorry, we're not going to do this. I think, and that's a question that organizations both in the global north, but also in the countries that we're working in and working with, they'll be very reluctant to go down that road. And ultimately, that's the challenge.
Themrise, do you have a short answer before we move over to Ralph's question?
Very short. I'll just use evaluation as an example, because I've been an evaluator as well of donor programming. And evaluations of donor programming are traditionally not done by the recipient country. They're always done by the donor. And the third party, quote unquote, third party contractor that does the evaluation is also from that donor country in most cases, or if not, then from another third country. And I find that just so both ironic and contradictory, because you're spending money in country A, but country A doesn't have the voice or the power to evaluate the money coming in. We're used as respondents for the evaluation interviews, but we don't actually get to evaluate. And I find that very, very contradictory and very condescending as well. So for me, I would just use that example to talk about the fact that this is what we're dealing with. And I think a lot of us need to now push back. And I think a lot of us are pushing back. We never did traditionally, but gradually. But we're getting a lot of backlash as well, because it's not easy to push back against donors. But we're trying. Absolutely trying.
No, absolutely. It's definitely not an easy thing. I mean, donors, especially foundations and governments, yeah, it can be incredibly hard for some of these small organizations to do so. So Ralph, I see your hand raised twice. I don't know if that's an error, but I will go with the first Ralph.
Yes, sorry for that. It kicked me out of my other device, and I just managed to log in with the other one. I hope you can hear me fine now. First of all, thank you very much for the wonderful ideas, presentation, and thoughts, and for making this important topic, putting it on the agenda. I'd like to say a couple of thoughts about the question of colonial legacy, and I guess also to Themrise's point. And I very much agree there with the sentiment where it holds us back to empower ourselves and do what we can do where it holds us back to blame others or to hang on decolonizing ideas. I agree that we should do anything that we can at this moment to get power and to change things as we see need fit. But I also agree that there is a colonial legacy, and maybe in different and more concrete terms. If we look at the modern state or the nation state at all, it has we couldn't imagine having this international state system. And Themrise, we're talking about the relations between different nations and governments. Colonization wasn't one way. The modern state system, international state system, came only really into a global effect once the formerly colonized countries basically took up that mantle of the modern state, of the nation state. And in the way we are governing, we are adhering to this form administratively and in so many other different ways in terms of the political technologies. We adapted what we learned there into new and modern ways of working with it. And, you know, I'm sitting here in a country in Ethiopia, which was never colonized by Western power or by European power. But we have here this discourse going on of the Ethiopian Empire being a colonial power itself, colonializing a lot of these regions that are part of this state now. And if you look at the technologies, about the mechanisms, it is very similar. And we have that in other areas of the world as well.
Oh,
so
sorry, Ralph, to excuse you.
Question.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but firstly, we are coming to time. And also, if you could just slow down a little bit for our interpreters so they're able to continue to do their work. Thank you.
My apologies, and let me come to a close. So what I want to say is that maybe it's more about the mechanics of how our governments work, how our systems work right now, and also the aid system, how it curtails foreign policy and so on, and not so much about the question if the former powers are still the ones who are in power in each and every case. So thank you very much, and sorry for taking up.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Unfortunately, we have come to time. And so I think this is a beautiful place to end, talking about mechanisms, talking about how much more there is for us to do and how much more conversation there is for us to have. I do want to take a minute to thank Amjad and Themrise for your wonderful thoughts, ideas, as well as our interpreters, Melody, Luvia, Ahsen, and Yasser, for taking the time to make sure that this event was as accessible as possible. I also want to apologize for the technical difficulties that we've had. I think we were so excited to see the enthusiasm for this conversation, and it really surprised us how just managing all of it proved a little bit more challenging than we expected. So thank you all for your patience, and I'm so pleased you were able to join us. Dylan, if you have any last words.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you all for joining us for this fantastic conversation. I just wanted to wrap up by saying a few things. I heard some very important invitations here from our speakers. The first one was an invitation to push back where we see injustices and push back to our donors and to other people within the system who are perpetuating some of the problems that we see in the system. There was an invitation also to be brave and have those difficult conversations. And that bravery is something that we're learning to do to be better at Peace Direct. And I would encourage us all to try and be brave. It is not easy to have these conversations. And the third invitation really is an invitation to you all. We are, as Shannon said, we're starting this conversation. We're hoping to have much more over the coming months, and we're really looking forward to having that conversation with you all. So we expect to have at least 3 more global consultations on decolonizing, looking at specific areas. It might be around monitoring and evaluation, as Themrise just said. It might be on partnerships. It might be on philanthropy. And we invite you to help us think about which ones are the right ones to focus on, and to get deep into those issues, and then to come up with some recommendations. So that's where we're heading next. We really look forward to you joining us in those conversations. And so watch out for the notifications on our social media. Thank you once again for your input and for your patience with us with these technical problems that we've had, and hope you will join us for future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Very much. Bye.
Thank you.